Welcome, welcome. Apologize for the darkness. We literally had a power outage here 2 minutes before the show. No, it's not because we don't know what we're doing. We're experiencing a gigantic weather storm and they've issued emergency warnings. So bear with us. I'm right here in the Central Valley in Fresno, but we're going to make it happen. With us today, we have Professor FH Buckley, and we're going to be talking about national divorce and Marjorie Taylor Greene. Let me introduce the professor, if I may. Here we go. FH Buckley works at the Antonin Scalia Law School at the George Mason University. And he has been a foundation professor at the Antonin Scalia Law School, George Mason University. He is a frequent media guest and has appeared on The Morning Joe, CNN, Rush Limbaugh, CNN's, C-SPAN's Washington Journal, Newsmax, Radio France, the CBC, NPR, and many others. He's also a senior editor at the American Spectator, columnist for the New York Post, and he's written for the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, U.S. News, National Review, the American Conservative, the New Criterion, Real Clear Politics, the National Post, the Telegraph, among others. Here's an example of articles he's written in the Wall Street Journal. He's also written for The Hill magazine, and I'm quite jealous. He actually was interviewed by Sagar and Crystal on The Hill magazine. So very jealous. And he's written this book, American Secession, The Looming Threat of a National Breakup, which I love, and I own a copy because I was mentioned in the book. So we are here today with FH Buckley. Did I get anything wrong, Professor? Was there something you'd like to say?
You were pretty long-winded, okay, about me. So
sorry.
All right. No, this is fine. The only thing you might have mentioned is that I have for 74 years of my life been a Canadian and only 8 an American. So because of my background in Canada and the fact that I lived in Montreal, secession for me is not something that should be unexpected. It's not unusual for many countries to go through a discussion about secession. And indeed, it can be very, very healthy. So I'm not automatically opposed to it the way I think many Americans are.
Absolutely. And I recall in the article that, let me see if I can find it. Here we go. Let me show everybody the article. This is the article that we're covering, and this is where Professor Buckley had said something to this effect. I want to cover the exact quote. It was something about people cannot talk about how, if secession is off the table, then we're back in the British Empire. So if you're an American, I think you have to begin with the idea that secession is sometimes permitted,
Right.
Buckley said.
Yeah.
Desiree News in this article. We're interviewing every expert we can from this article here. What does that mean? Is there, well, first, before we get to that, in your opinion, what happened recently with Marjorie Taylor Greene? What did she say about national divorce? I don't want to frame it. This is why I asked the guest to frame it, so it's not me putting medicine. What, in your opinion, what happened? Why are people talking about it? Is it worthy to talk about?
Well, I think she's a bit of a nutcase. Okay, so she's not a spokesman for, a rational, reasonable kind of secession, as you are. All right. So, forget the personalities who are behind it. Ask yourself instead, is it something you're unalterably opposed to? If you are, as you noted, right, then how do you feel about 1776? And moreover, we've had 3 secessions, right? We had 1776. We had 1836 when Texas secedes from Mexico and then joins us eventually, and 1861. And all 3 of those led to a war. What we're talking about now is secession 4.0, and I don't think it would lead to a war, right? And that's why I think we should, clear the table a little bit to imagine what a peaceful secession would look like, because, that's the kind of conversation people are having in England or Britain with respect to Scotland, Canada with respect to Quebec or maybe Alberta, Spain with respect to Catalonia. There are secession movements in Belgium, You had the Velvet Divorce of Czechoslovakia. So this doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. I don't think it would involve war, right? Moreover, the other thing to recall is what we're not talking about is building a wall around, say, California, right? In other words, the discussion we'd be talking about would lead to something which Quebec separatists call sovereignty association. So if California seceded, you wouldn't want to cut off all economic ties, right? So you'd probably want, undoubtedly you'd want some kind of free trade arrangement. You'd probably want something like free movement of goods and people. There'd have to be a discussion about California's assumption of the national debt, about what happens to the Pacific Fleet in San Diego. There are a whole bunch of things you'd have to talk about. And probably what that would lead to is an Article 5 Convention of the States. So, and rather than think of this being something like a unilateral declaration of independence, it's better to think about it as a legitimate exit strategy, which is protected by Article 5 of our Constitution. So that's how it would work out. And, and that might lead in any number of directions. It might mean, for example, that California would have to gain more control of its finances, right? At this point, more money flows from California to DC than the other way around. So that's something that Californians might want to talk about. Californians might want to have a say on the size of our military budget. Look, we spend 38% of the world's military budget on arms, more than the next 9 countries put together, 6 of which are our allies. We spend roughly 3 times more than the rest of NATO put together. So, those are the kinds of discussions people might want to have, right? There's a whole package there, and it would be nice to unpackage parts of it. So, rather than a complete separation, I don't think anyone would want that, right? Very possibly you wouldn't. You wouldn't want to have a passport to go to Las Vegas, for example, right? And so all these things can be worked out.
The question I have is, you seem open, like I am, to having this discussion. Seems I might be taking a limb, but it seems to be saying many Western countries that are thriving democracies allow a discussion for peaceful separation. That's kind of what happens in the Western democracies. My question for you is, when I was watching all the commentary about Marjorie Taylor Greene and her talking about national divorce, everybody was saying, this is how the Civil War started. She's starting the Civil War. This is how the Civil War started. And I kept going, that's not right. Just going off my 7th grade history class, the South left Congress, said we don't want to talk with you, moved back to their Southern installations, closed all negotiation, and then started shooting them. Marjorie Taylor Greene has stayed in her congressional position, said she wanted a negotiated position, tried to start a dialogue with other congressional leaders, and said, I reject violence. Why is everybody saying these are the two same things when they're absolutely diametrically opposed? And how come so many people are getting basic American history wrong?
Well, one of the crucial events in our history is a Civil War, and nobody wants to repeat that. So, if you talk about the possibility of secession, that problem's going to arise. Now, you're right. The problem starts with South Carolina firing on Fort Sumter. And at the time, someone said of South Carolina, it's too small to be a nation and too big to be an insane asylum. Right? So, as well, it doesn't help if your spokesperson is someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, right?
Sure.
If this were taken up by a more serious person, then it would have some legs. And let's not forget that in June of 2020, at a time when it looked like Trump might be reelected, senior Democratic honchos got together and game planned it. And they said, well, one of the things we might be talking about is California secession.
Mm-hmm.
right? And and that
Mm-hmm.
was Jim Podesta, who was the chairman of the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016. So you'd need the discussion at that kind of level. As well, if you want to try to imagine how it could happen, you have to ask yourself, well, what would be the split between the White House, because this is a presidential form of government, and the states? So when you have a Democrat in the White House, it's the Marjorie Taylor Greens who talk about secession. If in 2024 Trump or
Right.
a Trump-like person were elected, now I think you'd see serious discussions about secession, all I'm saying is, don't be afraid of that. Moreover, the more democratic the country, the more it is prepared to talk about this, right? If Great Britain is prepared to talk about Scottish secession as it is, that's a sign that it's democratic,
That's
right?
what I felt was they go, yes, we're not perfect, but in China and Russia, you start talking about this, they clamp down. And I thought, isn't it a sign that we are democracies, that we are the Western order, that will allow conversations that may not be to our benefit because we so strongly believe in the right to have discussions, unlike
Absolutely,
China and Russia?
absolutely right. And I see nothing wrong with those kinds of discussions. They seem to be profitable. Plus, I mean, apart from everything else, when I wrote my book called American Secession, I made the point that bigness is badness. We're maybe just too darn big. And, you know, one size fits all from Washington is, I think, not exactly healthy. We also, in our government, have arrived at uh, this place. We have a government where all power is centralized in Washington, constitutionally, really, and within Washington and the presidency. So what you get is kind of a winner take all politics. I mean,
Absolutely.
who wins the White House, determines the rules we live by. And that's utterly inconsistent with the way we started with the separation of powers. So, the evolution of the American Constitution, the decline of the separation of powers, tends to explain where we are right now. Um,
Interesting.
we wouldn't have had this conversation so much in the past, but here, when and by the way, I'm a never Trumper. Okay, so let's get that clear. But so if it were the case that a Trump were elected, I can see how people like many Democrats would think now it's time to say goodbye, and that makes perfect sense. And by the way, in those circumstances, what would a Republican president do? Well, he might well think, here's what the electoral map looks like without California, so don't let the door hit you on the way out.
That's what we said. That's what we said.
So that would open up, I think, mutually profitable discussions about downsizing the size of the federal government at a minimum, right? And that I think that would be a good thing, in fact.
I heard that. And Professor Griffiths, who was also featured in the article along with you by Deseret News, and I think Chuck DeVore, all said, hey, if you're talking about state splits like we've done 50 times or whatever, that's one thing. If you're talking about secession, it's another. What grabbed me, though, was that when I talk with you, you're aware of the facts. And you seem to give a straightforward analysis of the facts. The reason that I zeroed in on that Deseret article and then reached out to you and everybody else was it was the only article that I could find out of 40 that actually acknowledged the facts. All of the rest of them were saying, this is exactly how the Civil War started, which is a lie. And the other ones were saying, there's no division in America. Marjorie Taylor Greene is making this up. I literally saw Anna Kasparian on the Young Turks and Joy Reid on MSNBC and Jack Probick on Real Clear Politics, people who are alt-right and alt-left, 24 hours after she made her tweet going, what is she talking about?
Yeah.
There's no division. There hasn't been division. She's making division. And none of them would bring up the fact that you did.
Yeah.
Didn't the Democrats look at full-blown secession with the Biden election? Not mentioned by anybody
I
at
know.
all.
I know.
Or Joe Biden giving his speech on ultra MAGA where he basically said 74 million Americans are enemies of the state, to the point that polls showed his own Democratic Party felt that he caused division? None of that's mentioned.
I know.
So why do we have articles by people on the left and the right ubiquitously in lockstep where they're saying, this is how the Civil War started, that's a lie, and we have no division at all, never had, that's a lie? So why is everybody able to bold-face lie across so many platforms on both sides and ignore history? I mean, Joe Biden made that speech on Ultra MAGA. It was national news. Now everybody forgets? How'd you forget national news? It's only 6 months older. How's this happen?
I know. But the subject is heating up. I mean, I had a debate last week in New York before a Reason crowd, a libertarian crowd, on the subject. And I'll be for half an hour on a Slate podcast on Monday on the subject of secession. So, yeah, so, I end up talking about it a little bit. And, mostly what I'm telling people is, take a Valium, chill. This is not the end of the world. It's not crazy. It's happening elsewhere. And it wouldn't lead either to, I think, a war or to anything, drastic, like a complete separation. I think what it would tend to do would be to accelerate sorting of the kind that happens right now. So the great winner would be U-Haul, right? I mean,
Right.
this is not exactly a big deal. In fact, it would more closely resemble a return to the America of the founders, where the states were so much more powerful than anything like 1861. Moreover, it's not as if we'd be returning to the Dark Ages. The Civil Rights Revolution has taken hold everywhere. So nobody's going back to a totally racist state. There wouldn't be anything like that. And I think it'd be important for both sides to say, well, if another state goes a different way on some subject, I think important, yeah, they have different kinds of laws in Albania than we do here, and if they have different laws in Texas than we have here, well, live with it, right? I mean, people are permitted to choose their forms of government, so beware of the kind of imperialism where we try to enforce our values on Nigeria or whatever the liberal values are that are to be imposed on Texas, say. I wouldn't, here's one thing you might worry about a little bit.
Please.
In the debates about forming our government, Alexander Hamilton wanted to abolish the states, right? And he didn't get that, right? But constitutionally, that's kind of where we are. What he said is, well, it's not that I want to completely abolish states. They should exist, but only as subservient to a sovereign national government. That's kind of where we are now. There are no limits whatsoever to what the feds can do, and no constitutional limits. The only limits are prudential. So, for example, pot on Venice Beach, right? Illegal under federal law, legal under California law. So what are the feds going to do about it? Well, Bush was in office and he did nothing about it. If you wanted to do something about it, you'd have to increase the size of a DEA tenfold. And nobody wants to do that. Nobody, we have all kinds of federal criminal laws, but to really enforce them in the face of state opposition, we might have to increase the size of the FBI tenfold.
Right.
Okay. Constitutionally, that's possible. Politically, it's not possible. So all I'm saying is there are no constitutional barriers, almost none, to what the national government can do. There's something called the 10th Amendment, but it's almost completely ignored. Okay. It has very narrow purchase. So, the national government constitutionally is permitted to do whatever it wants. It's just, politically, it's not feasible at this point. If that changed, right? If, in other words, somehow the national government decided to enforce federal pot laws in California, wow, I think California would pay a lot of attention to that. So what bothers me is here's where we are now, where we could be in the future, where it looks like the direction of things is an ever expanding federal presence. And as I say, one size fits all makes no sense to me.
I have a few more questions, but let me just ask you, since we talked a few years ago, since you published your book, Donald Trump's president, liberals, I'm one, I was here in California, I'll attest to it. They're going crazy. Let's secede. 1/3 of Californians said, let's go. 47.5% of Californians said, I'm willing to have a full-blown discussion on secession. It's 4 years later. Now we're seeing the right talk about it. Have things calmed down since you wrote your book? Is the discussion about a division getting worse, becoming more normalized? Because I talked to some other experts and they go, oh, just because Marjorie Taylor Greene said this and she's a sitting member of Congress and you haven't had a sitting member of Congress talk about secession since 1860 doesn't mean this conversation is being normalized. And I'm like, are you guys in a vacuum? Do you not see how it's getting worse every day? I don't mean to prejudice your answer, but is America coming back together in the last 3 to 4 years, or does it seem to be pulling apart? Did Joe Biden bring this national calm healing period and bring us back together? Or has basically nothing gotten fixed in the last 3 years and we're getting worse off every day?
Yeah, I agree with that. It's not gotten better, it's gotten worse. The divisions, the emotional divisions are stronger than ever before, and that's painful. I mean, I think there's a greater sense of loneliness and lack of friendship than there was, 20, 30 years ago, 10 years ago, even. That's painful. I think, a national divorce of some kind might help in that respect. But I wouldn't look for Republicans to pick up the torch on this one under a Democratic president. The most likely scenario, as I say, is a Republican president who's way out there and a Democratic opposition, liberal opposition that says enough already. I mean, by the way, I see this all the time because, like I say, I'm originally from Canada and I lived through this in Quebec, so for me, it's not a big deal. And in a way, it's sort of like the way everybody says, "I'm going to move to Canada," and they never do. Or they, if they do, they'll return after a couple of years when they've experienced a couple of Canadian winters. So, there's a lot of rhetoric there,
Yeah.
but the
Yeah.
talk about the possibility of a democratic secession, a democratic-led secession, at a different level. That is the way it might happen, right? Here's another thing to think about. I've been trying to rehabilitate James Buchanan, who was really an awful person in many respects, right? But in 1860, what he said is, okay, South Carolina wants to secede, but what am I supposed to do? Invade? Right? I don't want to go
Right.
to war on this.
Right.
And, Abraham Lincoln was a different animal. And he was willing to live with slavery, but he wasn't willing to live with disunion. So he called up the troops, and Virginia passed an ordinance of secession the next day, right? And when that was ratified, my hometown of Alexandria was invaded by the federal troops the next day. I agree. The worst thing you want to see is an armed invasion of your state.
Absolutely.
Okay,
And
I'm all for Ike and Little Rock enforcing federal laws, but when you're talking secession, now you should be talking about this over the bargaining table.
I agree. And that was the thing that got me, was that everybody was saying she means violent civil war. And I said, no, she doesn't. I did a show that day and I go, she did not say, I exclude any negotiated settlement. I absolutely reject all discussion. I'm encouraging everybody to leave the government and have no talk. I was like, there's nothing there. And then the very next day, she issued another tweet going, I mean a negotiated settlement. Literally the day after. No, I get it. She's crazy. I get it.
Right. Okay.
But it's not fair to attribute thoughts to a person in America that they didn't give. She means civil war. She said the opposite. Well, I know she means this.
Right.
How do you know that? Oh, she must mean let's start shooting each other. Or, the other thing that gets me is, I understand she's crazy. I understand she's not a good spokesperson, but why is it okay for politicians, history professors, federal lawyers, and news people to straight up lie about there's no division in America and the history of the Civil War? I get she's not a great person, but if you're a politician, a federal prosecutor, a historian, or a news person, don't you have an obligation to not lie about basic facts to the American people?
Yeah, I think from your perspective, Mary, I think what you want to do is concentrate or read more about Quebec secession movements, because what was proposed, what people voted on twice, was not shall we secede. What they voted on was the following: shall we authorize the Quebec government to negotiate a form of sovereignty plus association with the rest of Canada? So, for starters, it wasn't going to be a wall between them. And behind it all was there are going to be a lot of people sitting down and talking about how to negotiate this, and that's how you do it. And that's basically what the international law on all of this is as well. By the way, I mean an important aspect of this is international law. What happened if California seceded and nobody recognized it?
Right.
So um, Quebec was smart enough to open up consulates in other countries beforehand. So that's one of the things you'd want to do. You'd want to have a California foreign policy, right? Before you secede, pretend you're foreign. Go through those kinds of motions. That's part of how it's done. And lay on the table a scenario which completely excludes violence and which expresses a total openness to discuss the framework of the new arrangement. That's what it would be, a new arrangement, right? With shared passports, shared a lot of things. That's what when I debate this sort of thing. That's the kind of thing that really gets people. Will I need a passport to see my in-laws in Oklahoma? That type of thing. So laying the groundwork, I think what you have to do is assure people you're not talking about that. You're not talking about Fort Sumter, to be sure, but in addition, you're not talking about a radical break that leaves anybody feeling it hard done by in all of this. So we'll accept our responsibilities about the federal debt and so on. And we'll try to ensure that this is as painless as possible for everybody involved. 60% of Americans live in a country different from the country they were from, live in a state different from the state they were born in. So moving around is very American, right? There would be a bit more of this. That's all.
One of the things that I heard was, and you're on the same opinion as me, was, oh, if you break off, international trade's gone. We'll have these walls and barriers, nobody can trade. And I go, that's not the way the world's worked since the 1990s. Since the 1990s and the fall of the Cold War, we have only gone to more trade deals between more countries. Russia's doing it, China's doing it, Africa's doing it, India's doing it, America's doing it. We redid the NAFTA agreement. Why is it more reasonable to say, oh, if there were separate states, they just say, let's ruin our economy and not sign trade deals, versus going, okay, I'm a separate organ, but if I agree to NAFTA, then I'm automatically back in the same standards with America, and I can continue doing international trade like just before. Scotland made this exact same argument. They said, actually, because there's so many international trade organizations, it's easier for us to secede than not. Why are so many people saying the exact opposite from the way the world trajectory is going?
Well, it is an issue. I mean, when Quebec wanted to separate, they announced, look, we want to stay part of NATO, right? And we want to stay part of free trade agreements and all of that stuff. And so California proposing to cede might say the same sort of thing, right? But it's not 100%. And here's an example. When the Brits left Europe with Brexit, that's a little like what we're talking about. And part of a selling point for Brexit was the thought that we could, in Britain, negotiate a free trade agreement with the United States. Well, guess what? Biden turned that down, right? Biden preferred Europe, in other words. Other countries are more willing to talk about it. There's something going on right now which is of interest, which is called
Texit?
No, no, CANZUK, which is a proposed free movement of people and goods between Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand.
Oh,
There are 5 settler countries. We're one of them. And so, there's a tendency towards integration amongst the settler societies because hey, we all ended up in the same place when you get down to it,
We all
right?
speak English.
You know,
Know who the queen is.
Within 3 years, for example, around 1920, UK, US, Canada all give women the vote. It's like things happen at the same time. So there are those kinds of unities that go beyond constitutional structures, but it's not 100%. So yeah, you're taking a certain risk about, for example, NATO or NAFTA, right? I mean, California sells goods in Mexico and Canada. Probably those countries would be more than happy, delighted to keep California as part of the agreement. But if your lawyer will never tell you that things are 100%.
Sure, sure.
So
And
there is always a smidgen of risk there.
I think California is on a different footing than other states simply
Yeah,
because we
because
did so much.
California is so desirable
Yeah,
as
and
a
we
trading
have
partner.
a bunch of international trade deals and climate deals, and I understand it might be different from the states. I was just curious of your opinion because a lot of people were saying, "Oh, division means automatically no trade deals," and I'm like, "Who
No,
thinks
no.
like that? Who's going to say, 'Oh, let's cut off our economy from
Yeah, right.
trade and not have goods?'" And I'm like, everybody's saying that, and I go, "That's some of the dumbest stuff I've heard. That's literally not the way anybody thinks who has
Yeah.
a brain about the economy for the last 3 decades."
It'd be a little different if Rhode Island seceded, okay?
Sure, sure, sure,
Yeah, I'll give
sure.
you that. But
Fair enough. Yeah, yeah,
California, no,
sure.
not going to happen.
Okay, let me ask you another question, if I may. I'm going to read a quote, and then I'd like to ask your opinion. The political divisiveness he sees in America is worse than anything he saw in Canada, he said, when a slim 50.5% of Quebec residents voted to remain part of the country. In an age where religion doesn't matter so much, politics represents the deepest beliefs of any individual, Buckley said. And it means that divisions between us are vastly more bitter than anything I saw in Quebec in the middle of the secession referendum.
Yeah, right. So during the secession crisis in Quebec, I was teaching a law school, and I had colleagues who were separatists and colleagues who were federalists, and we kind of looked at each other and we thought, well, hey, is this going to be a big deal here amongst us? And we thought, no, our private friendships are way more important than this issue. And I gather they had the same discussion in the dressing room of the Montreal Canadiens, the Habs. Okay, so like, hey, we're just buddies. We'll go out and grab a beer or whatever, and we're not going to lose friendships over this. But there's so little friendship between people on different sides of a political issue right now that just looked at it emotionally, we're way, way, way more ready to have a secession here than in Quebec, I think. And I saw, by the way, no violence. There was no violence over secession in Quebec. We're a different, more violent country, and maybe we'd be healthier if we didn't have to live with people we despise.
That's where I'm going.
Yeah, I mean, it's
resentment.
let's sort ourselves out. I mean, the sorting out is going to happen anyway. It's happening right now. People move to California. People move from California. This would accelerate things, although maybe not all that much, frankly. You know. So, as for religion being less important, Belgium was created in 1830 as a secession from the Netherlands because it was Protestant and Belgium was Catholic. But it turns out the Catholics in Belgium are divided between the Flemings and the Walloons,
Right.
right? And that's a language difference, and the language is more important right now. And so there are secession movements in the Flemish part of Belgium.
I saw that. I saw that. One of the things that I've heard, and this is why I liked your quote, was that some of the experts on secession movements were saying, well, most of the secession movements are ethnic conflicts where these ethnic groups had problems with each other. And I go, wasn't the American Revolution a secession movement, just like you said? And I go, those people all spoke English, and the Americans had English culture. It wasn't until the 1800s with Merriam-Webster and starting to come up with a separate English diction that we actually started saying, oh, we need to have a separate American culture that doesn't look like what the English said. So for the first 100 years, these were largely Englishmen. I'm looking at what you're saying about Quebec, and it's not ethnic. I mean, there was a French-English component, but it seemed to be religion. So is ethnicity the only thing that can split people apart, or sometimes politics and religion is as potent a driving force?
Language is really important because it cabins in the way we think. We think differently in different languages. I was bilingual. I've taught in French. It's not such a big deal for me, but I recognize that you approach the world differently in different languages, and so you see that in Quebec, and you see that in Belgium, for example, and you don't see it in America, right? I mean, there's a common language. So that makes, I mean, if you were a probabilistic betting man, you'd say that makes secession less likely here than in Canada.
Sure.
Interestingly enough, there's a secession movement in Alberta right now, which feels it's been hard done by Ottawa. There's one other thing to think about, by the way, in terms of secession, and that is that we're so different from 1861. In 1861 or 1860, everybody in South Carolina, every federal employee in South Carolina immediately resigned and was hired by the state. Whereas the federal tentacles descend so deeply into each state, it's harder to effect that kind of separation.
Right.
There are a whole bunch of difficult questions about breaking apart. I mean, I don't think Mississippi would break apart and put Social Security on the table, right? I mean, those checks
Right.
come from Washington, right, and not Montgomery. So that makes secession less likely than it was in 1860.
That's another question I had was, even when critics were saying, well, maybe she means splitting states apart, maybe she means secession. But either way, how would we ever split states apart? It's impossible to split states apart. You could never do this. How would you even think about this? I took 1 minute on Google and I found out that 29 out of our 50 states were broken off from previous larger sections of territory. In fact, we've had more states in America formed by having a larger chunk and breaking off the east, west, north, south corner. How did everyone forget that when they said, we don't know how you'd split state stuff?
Yeah.
I mean, most of America was formed this way. It's also in the Constitution going back 200 years. Total blank awareness of this fact on both sides. How did that happen?
Yeah, you also get people saying, how could you have secession in Texas when you've got Austin? And, the answer is, well, gosh, even in 1860, 61, states were divided. I mean, Virginia voted twice on secession and voted to stay with the Union. Okay. And then Lincoln called up the troops, and the next day Virginia said, we're going to secede. And by the way, if you go through the debates on the formation of our Constitution in 1787, Madison would have said Virginia was right. Madison said he said this on May 31, 1787. He said, the idea that the federal government might invade a state would be taken by that state as a destruction of the compact that kept them together. And and they would be entitled to leave. So,
Fast.
if ever you had the kind of invasion that we went through then. As for Virginia, one reason why Virginia was Unionist for many of the votes on this was West Virginia was part of Virginia.
Right.
And West Virginia was split apart from Virginia through constitutionally devious means.
Thank you.
To give Lincoln the votes he needed for the 13th Amendment. I mean, a rump government of Alexandria, a unionist government of Alexandria, was set up in Alexandria, Virginia, Union-occupied Alexandria, Virginia, which represented basically nobody in Virginia, and which decided, okay, West Virginia, off you go.
Right.
So that can happen. I mean, this could happen in California. I mean, if Northern California wants to stay in the Union, that would be on the table as well.
That was something I'd like to ask you. This is one of the, I only have like one or two more questions, but this is something I wanted to ask you. So I don't know if you can see this map. I know it's a little blurry.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, so in the background is a population density map, and you can see green going into yellow and then bright red pockets.
Yeah.
And then in the foreground is Texas and Georgia and election maps. And I was just thinking, okay, well, they're saying we can't split these people, but if you draw a line between the major urban center and the rest of the state, you have about 2/3 of the state, which is hardcore red and conservative and rural.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a section or an edge of the state. Why can't we divide states this way, since that's what we did 29 times
Right.
before?
You've got the Greater Idaho movement going on
Mhm.
right now in Oregon.
Yeah.
I mean, to get that working, what you'd need is the agreement of Idaho, Oregon, and the federal government. Okay,
Right.
gosh, I don't know if it would ever happen. Oregon, the governor of Oregon doesn't want that to happen, but I can see how it might be tempting. I mean, can you imagine if you're in a state where you've got a political minority that really, 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 truly does hate you, and you have the prospect of getting rid of them? I mean, it's got to be a little tempting.
Yeah, and I understand with the law that the host state has to allow this breakaway state to
Yeah.
go and that, but assuming that they were reasonable, and you're right, I've talked to some of the Oregon separatists, and they're going, most of our state by land, not population, is conservative. It's
Hmm.
these a few cities on the coast that have gigantic populations. And the governor basically doesn't want to give up the rest of the state because you lose economic power and clout. And so she'd rather just ram liberal bills that she knows 2/3 of her state don't like, because she knows she can win every single election. And it's better to just push stuff on those people, not allow them to leave, because you still get to have the Oregon powerhouse, economic clout, et cetera.
Yeah, but you know what? The economic clout comes from those uh, far western liberal cities, whereas the part of Oregon that wants to secede is the more economically dependent part. You know, heavy Medicaid, Medicare users. It might be economically a good deal to let it happen if you were the governor in Oregon. As for Idaho, I don't know. Somehow they want to be Grossa, Idaho. Sort of like
Yeah.
a German thing. I don't know.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
that's fine. That's fine.
yeah.
If we
But
look at,
if they want to,
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
yeah, no. If you can imagine a scenario where it might happen. The scenario might be one in which it is politically and economically advantageous to let it happen, right? And
Yeah.
frankly, it's both that right now.
I'm not opposed to letting people vote. One of the things I noticed with California is, like, my stepdad, right? He voted for Trump, but he's also married to a Mexican woman, my mom, and he's also helped 4 different illegal immigrants harbor in the country and achieve legal status. So I don't know many Trump supporters that do that. And basically the thing is that, yeah, we have these conservatives here, but if you're in the Bay Area in LA, you're not going anywhere. You would have left before if you hated
Yeah.
it that bad. You got family connections or your business is here. The only place conservatives are overwhelmingly dominant is in the very far north or the mountains, not the
Yeah.
central plains, not the cities. And I was like, it's kind of an easy split to separate the mountains from the
Yeah.
cities. Right.
Geographically, yeah. And by the way, congrats to your family. I mean,
Thank you.
you guys sound like you're working it out pretty well. That's good.
He gets to watch Newsmax. My mom calls it the Angry Man Show, for an hour and a half, and then when it's dinner, he can't watch it. But then he gets to repeat, what he saw in the car. But then if she has something like, hey, I want to get a new maid, and he goes, okay, I'll get the checkbook. I know what that means. They're going to start paying lawyers. So, but this is a California Trump voter. This is what I mean. This is a
California. Well, if we stop seeing the other side as the devil, it would be, we'd be so much happier.
That's
it's the loneliness, it's the want of friendship, the loss of solidarity, all of those old-fashioned virtues, dare I say Catholic virtues, that are so important.
I'm not Catholic, but my mom is, and I've been to Mass, been raised in it. I go to Mass with her.
All right, so there you go. Well, yeah, James Joyce said the motto of the church is "Here comes everybody," and that's kind of nice. I saw a papal audience at Castle Gandolfo once with Pope John Paul, and you see every nation in the world there, and that's so heartening, right? You see people with Filipino flags and South Americans and, people from France and whatever. So we're a world of nations. And if we end up with one extra nation because of secession, it's not such a big deal.
I don't think so. We had 50 nations roughly after World War II. Now we have around 210.
Yeah.
2/3 of the nations were born from secession. The majority of nations that exist today were born from secession movements, most of which were peaceful. Not all.
Yeah.
I'll leave you with this last question. And if you have a question for me, you want to talk, we can go there. But this is something I've been hearing from the audience. Okay, Mark, divisions here. Sounds like you're for it. No, I'm not for it. Well, how would you fix America? If you had a crystal ball, wizard's hat, magic stick, and you could just go zim, zim, zalabim, what big changes in the way Americans behave or talk or act or things they would do would you say that looks like a country that's healing itself and getting out of division? Because we had talked earlier and the division seems to be growing. What would you expect to see, Professor, that would show an America coming back together? What does that look like?
In 1882, a Frenchman, Ernest Renan, wrote a book, a little pamphlet called What's a Nation? And he said, what makes a nation is a memory of glorious things in our past and a certain amnesia about the inglorious ones. Well, we've had a period in the last couple of years where we're asked to forget all the glorious things in our past, and we've had our noses rubbed in the inglorious things. And that was a corrective, and we've lived through that. If Renan was right about what makes a nation, then we are two nations. But there's another sense in which we're a nation. We're a nation in the sense that we're all bound by what Lincoln called the electric cord of fidelity to the principles of the founders, the principles expressed in the Declaration of Independence. I think if we all went back to that and approached it with a certain amount of humility and self-knowledge about our own weaknesses, and if we remembered the importance of friendship and the problems of lack of solidarity, then I think we'd stay together. Whether that's a good thing, I'm not going to leave.
No, I love that answer because I haven't seen many people say that. What I've heard people say in the news is, well, you don't need to secede. We need marriage counseling. Okay, what's that mean? And I was able to talk to everybody saying we need marriage. There was a governor, Utah governor, who said this, and it was a soundbite. Now you're hearing everybody in the Democrats and the Republicans saying we don't need to secede. We don't need to break up. We need marriage counseling. And I was talking to a professor the other day, and I go, what does marriage counseling look like? And he goes, and I go, didn't we have Joe Biden run on he's going to bring the country back together? There's going to be a calming. And I go, if the president of America can't provide marriage counseling, who's going to be the marriage counselor?
Well, you know what marriage counseling is. It's the last thing you do before divorce.
I looked that up. The numbers are not great.
Yeah, right.
On people who go to, they're not, it's basically 50-50. Like, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But if Joe Biden said, I'm going to bring America together, and it's been 2 to 3 years and it has totally failed. I'm not saying if it's his fault or it's not. I'm just saying he ran on bringing it together. It hasn't worked. who's going to be the marriage counselor? Who does that job? The Supreme Court, Congress, Jesus comes back. I mean, who's going to lead both sides to go, kumbaya?
Yeah.
Who is that person? If the U.S. president couldn't pull it off, who's the single individual that we're used to bringing us together?
No such person, I'm afraid.
There you go. That's what I was looking for, was like, if Joe can do it, who's going to do it?
It's in each of us.
One story I had, if I may, was that I would, after National Division got together, was blowing up, I remember talking to some liberals, and they were saying, well, remember when Roe v. Wade got overturned? A lot of liberals were upset, and I saw a lot of liberals going on TV, and I'm a liberal too, but they were going on TV going, we need to reach out to the moderates. We need to reach out to the people that, maybe they're Republican or this or that, but they realize that this is just wrong to tell a woman what to do with her body. And I go, great. I'm a liberal, and I know a bunch of conservatives across America, and I can help you put together this coalition. So all of you Californians, mostly women, but not all, who want to protect a woman's right to choose, I know people who will back you, and they live in red states, and you can start building this coalition. But before you do, I need to warn you, they also believe a woman's place is kind of in the kitchen. They kind of believe in traditional religion. They definitely believe in having assault weapons and no rights on banning them, and a bunch of other stuff. So how many of you liberals are willing to work together with them? Ooh, gross. Nobody was interested. But they just got done saying Roe v. Wade was the existential issue, the most important thing. You guys can't.
Well, it's going to be a call to reasonableness on the right. I mean, you have some people who want, a ban on abortion pills, for example.
Sure.
Which is wacko.
Yeah, absolutely wacko.
But, people on the right have for years been saying, we have the most liberal abortion laws in the world. Look at what they're doing in Europe, right? They're much more conservative. They have a ban on abortion after week 20 or 25 or whatever. So that's what a sensible Republican Party is going to have to come up with. And if they do, it's not going to be such a wedge issue as liberals thought. I mean, I think the position I just described appeals to a majority of Americans. Again, part of our problem is the things which appeal to a majority of Americans can't get legislated because we have such a mess in Washington.
True.
Yeah. So there are a lot of liberal things, and there are a lot of conservative things that most people support and just can't get done. Like better immigration laws or better national health, all those sorts of things that most people want. Nothing happens over there. And that is part of the reason why divorce looks attractive, I think.
There was the Princeton University study, I think, in 2014, where they looked at all the laws going back to the 1970s, and they compared it to what the public had wanted versus what the elites had wanted. And I think the study was backed up by the Harvard Business School, and they came to the conclusion that what the public wanted had, quotes, an almost infinitesimal significance to what laws were actually passed. And this was looking at 40 years of history, and nobody has challenged that study, by the way. Nobody said.
I know. Yeah. That's
okay. We'll leave it there. I do want to say I don't want division. I don't want divorce, but I don't see it coming together. And I don't see liberals in my own thing saying, I'm willing to look past your gun laws and your religious things to come and work with you on other issues. I'm not seeing people willing to negotiate and compromise.
And my position is I'm not a secessionist, but I'm not afraid of the discussion.
And it's not wrong to have a discussion about a peaceful, legal manner of pursuing secession in a Western country.
Absolutely right.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to leave us with? Any comments, any thoughts you'd like to leave the audience with?
One little thing. There was this guy called G.K. Chesterton who was often wrong and sometimes really right. He was asked by a newspaper sent out a questionnaire to a whole bunch of people. And, the question was, what's wrong with the country? And his answer is, I am. So let's begin with maybe a greater sense of humility about all these things.
Oh, you've been going to mass.
Okay, come on now.
My mom says. Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We hope you all enjoyed, and I'll talk to you soon, Professor. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Take it easy.
Okay.